highly motivated for this first panel session of today on the topic of nature-related data for management. I have a fantastic panel for you with great speakers who have a lot of knowledge and know-how and expertise to share with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, having said that, I wish to briefly say some introductory remarks. We have heard yesterday a lot from the private sector on how they are going about sustainability, and they always mentioned actually in their talks, and I think everybody did that, how important the measurement is. We see that the enterprises are not only working now on limiting or eliminating the negative impacts, but understand also the necessity to work on regeneration. That means they understand that nature loss poses major risk to businesses, while moving to nature positive investments offers opportunities. And they're looking for science-based information to enable them to integrate nature into decision-making. And for such, they need, obviously, the understanding on nature-related dependencies and on impacts over multiple periods of time. That means what we are seeing is that recently, actually, accountability systems have popped up or have been designed, let's say, for nature. For instance, with the launch of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, Science-Based Targets Initiative for Nature that we have heard yesterday about. Also the Natural Capital Protocol, one of them. And all those are enabling a journey from do no harm to a do no harm approach to a full, just and regenerative business level. And by doing so, and then following such path and unlocking by doing so the benefits, the key to that is, and that we have heard yesterday also, to build competencies, and competencies to identify, measure, mitigate, and collaborate on these negative externalities that the sector creates. And one of these competencies is now obviously measurement. That what we have heard yesterday, or what transpired in all the discussions, is that the main actors are seemingly the companies, and those are at the heart of our tourism industry. At the accommodation sector, renting cars, boat services, restaurants, you name a few. And here I come to my first panelist, Jesús. Jesús, you are a socio-economic analyst in the General Directorate for the Environment of the European Commission, where you deal mostly with energy and climate issues. Jesús, from the European Commission perspective, taking these considerations that I just outlined and constellations into account, namely that the private sector is driving this, but needs the support, obviously, of the public sector. Looking at the Green Deal of the European Commission, how do you see deficiencies and challenges? Are there enough data available, nature-related data? Where to take this from? And who shall come first? Is it the private sector, the destinations, or the public sector? How do you see that?
So, as you know, the top priority of the European Union, of the European Commission under the current leadership of President von der Leyen is the European Green Deal. So it's the first time in the story of the European Union that really environment is the top priority of a commission. The purpose of the European Green Deal is really to tackle our interdependent environmental crisis. It's not only climate change, it's also biodiversity loss, it's pollution, and all these crises are driven by natural resources depletion. So what is important in the Green Deal is that it pretends to be systemic. So systemic means that if we want really to move towards sustainability, we have to change our consumption and production patterns, which is the SDG 11 that you have there on the left. In this framework, it's obvious that the role of the private sector is essential. Many of the policies under the European Green Deal are based on the idea of empowering consumers. So if we give up more transparent information to consumers, they are going to push the enterprises to follow more sustainable practices. Also, the enterprises that are more advanced are going to be incentivized. And at the end, we are going to have a virtuous circle between the policies, enterprises, citizens, obtaining a triple win for the business sector, citizens, and also the environment. So this is really the idea under the many of the policies of the Green Deal. Coming back to your question about the data. In this framework, is of course, data are essential. And when we talk about environmental data, we have some issues, I would say, but we can discuss this later. So we have more data on the pressures than on the situation of the and their impact on the environment. So we have data about emissions, we have data about waste, about water, etc., but less about the real estate of nature. This is particularly relevant when we talk about biodiversity. So on biodiversity, we are not so knowledgeable as in other fields. And then I mentioned before that the idea is really to tackle this interdependent crisis. Interdependent means complexity, yes. So in the past, we developed plenty of false good ideas, biofuels, first generation biofuels. We thought, okay, this is fantastic to reduce our emissions. And then we discovered that it was a complete disaster, that we were subsidizing the deforestation of Malaysia, Indonesia, etc. So at the end, this means that, yeah, it's complicated to understand the interrelations and what can be the impacts of different policies. So what do we need? Of course, we need to enhance our science base, but we need also this collaboration that I think is one of the words that has been repeated in this conference, and I fully agree. So we need collaborations between science, enterprises, civil society to improve the understanding and then to apply really solutions that that work really.
Thank you so much for that. Jesús is very much appreciated actually your insights into that. Concerning data, I think somebody who delivers data is my next speaker, Alexa Firmenich. You are the co-director of Seed Biocomplexity at Crowther Lab. We focus on ecology and climate at the Swiss Federal Institute for Technology. Alexa, in the Crowther Lab, you're dealing on a daily basis with nature-related data and are operating, as much as we know, one of the most important nature-related databases. You are providing the World Economic Forum with strategic intelligence, exploring and monitoring how biodiversity is affecting economics, industries, and global issues. One of the key findings that you have come up with is that human activity is destroying biodiversity faster than ever before, and that almost 80% of threatened species are impacted by economic activity. Your work has a huge significance for tourism, as biodiversity is at the heart of what drives our industry. So the question is, for whom do you produce the data? What are the demands? Who are demanding this data? How are they motivated? Are they intrinsic? And how the tourism industry can measure its impacts and relationships to this complex phenomenon?
Lots of good questions. Should I try and see if this works? I have visual slides to make biodiversity data interesting. So I'm the co-director of this initiative. We are an ecology and climate lab in ETH Zürich, which is a Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. So we map global patterns that relate to nature. And what we're creating with this project called Seed Biocomplexity is a high integrity measure of the underlying condition, back to your point, of the state of nature for anywhere on the planet. And our idea is that this metric will form the basis for a new global standard on what is biodiversity and how should we measure it and its change over time. So click here, yeah. I have to see what's behind me.
Alexa, there is this.
Oh, that's very useful. Thank you. I'm not used to having that there. So as you can see, we're creating an index that will enable, you were saying for who? Governments, financial institutions, standard setters, analytics providers, biodiversity credit providers, because yes, biodiversity credits are coming and it's going to be a mess. Those are the people we're offering to. I think it's useful to kind of look at what's been happening in this space. Disclosures and regulations are coming really, really quickly. In December, in the Kunming Montreal Agreement, 195 countries signed up to basically, there's different targets that are interesting, but there's one target, which is corporations will be required to disclose their impacts on nature, required to disclose their impacts on nature. That's huge. And you have SBTI and you have all of these initiatives that I won't list off now, but just to say that every, and the EU has their regulations coming through. So our encouragement is stay ahead of the curve, because this movement is here and they need something that's transparent, that's accountable, that's easy to use, and that's scalable. This is an ecosystem that never existed on the face of the planet, but it's, our model of nature, let's say. And what's really important is a lot of tools that are measuring nature are very reductionistic. They take a few aspects of an ecosystem, like a species count, and they say, this is biodiversity. This is very dangerous. Because if you take one element of nature and say that this is what nature is, and you propagate that at scale, you get monocultures. And so we're already seeing that if you just count species as biodiversity without things like genetics, without underground biodiversity, without the structure of ecosystems, you end up creating a lot of perverse outcomes. And we've seen that in the UK and Australia and other countries. So we are mapping the complexity and the structure and the shape of all of these different aspects of the living world. Genetic, species, and ecosystem variation. How do we do that? I probably won't have time to get too technical here, but essentially it's a kind of big data machine learning approach. So we take hundreds of maps. So these are global data layers of biodiversity. And we basically stack them, if you will, and we do a multidimensionality reduction approach, which sounds really fancy, but it's a way of bringing all the maps together for any pixel on the planet. And then you will get a rating of 0 to 1 for how similar or dissimilar your site is to what would naturally occur with minimal human intervention. And that's modeled by close key protected areas or sites close by. So we're thinking of showing it in this kind of shape where your site would be either close to the natural state or far from it. And it's fine, you don't have to be at a 1, but it's good to have this underlying state of nature. We combine that with satellite monitoring. I think we'll hear a bit more about satellites later to detect changes over time. And then we'll be able to take ground truth from local sites. So things like soil samples, environmental DNA, bioacoustics, so the sound of an ecosystem. And then the lab has another project, which is a nonprofit. You guys can look it up. It's super interesting. It's called Restore. And it's the world's largest database of global restoration sites. So if you're operating an ecotourism sites, and there's really interesting examples in ecotourism that I can email to you after, you basically draw your pixel and you get access to free open source ecological information on things like soil carbon, water cycles, evapotranspiration. And so you get to see how your site is changing. So you'll get something like that. You see how your site changes, and this will host our complexity index. That's it. I hope I stayed in time.
You're very Swiss.
Yeah.
Alexa, thank you so much. I think it's very impressive what you are doing. This is a very new area also with this nature-related data, and especially with regards to biodiversity. Everything is very fresh. We just got out from Montreal, and we are supposed to do all these things. So there's a lot of work ahead of us. I think you are going to be a very important player in this data collection process. And thank you so much for the insights. You have mentioned that a lot of data is coming also through thanks to satellites, which brings me to my next panelist. Her name is Cecilia Hertz. She's coming from Sweden. She is working with NASA and I.S.A.A. on space technologies since many, many years. You have created 2 companies, Umbilical Design and I.S.A.A.C. You will tell us more about that. You have also written a book about space and what we need to know about it. And you're very much into the astronaut lifestyle issues. Cecilia, yesterday we heard also Pedro Duque, the first Spanish astronaut, on how he perceived being an astronaut and what it means to take the space perspective when we look at nature, at our world. From that, what you're doing, so bringing the technologies, the knowledge that we have in space, for space, space travel, so to say, down to Earth and down to the tourism sector. What is the potential for tourism in this context, and especially related to data? Cecilia, please.
First of all, of course, thank you very much for inviting me here, and I'm happy to contribute with the space perspective. And of course, as you mentioned, it was great to have astronaut Pedro Duque introducing the subject of space for you who were here yesterday, and also talking about life on the International Space Station. Before entering specifically into tourism, I will briefly share my 24 years in the space sector. It will be short. So it also, but just to give you a small perspective, it started when I was a student in industrial design in Sweden. I got a unique opportunity to come to NASA Houston Johnson Space Center and working with all fantastic astronauts, engineers, people from all over the world. And specifically, it was a little space vehicle planned as a lifeboat for the International Space Station that we worked with as a diploma work that really got me so passionate about working in the space sector. And that inspired me so much that I decided to start my own company, Umbilical Design, and this was 2001. Initially only working with space architecture, with the astronauts and concepts for habitation on Moon and Mars. But after working with them and realizing how much research that is actually going on the space station, we saw there are so much technologies and concepts and that we really wanted to bring back down to earth and create new innovations, especially sustainable innovations, of course. So when people start talking more about circular economy, we thought that is what we've been working with all the time in the space sector. It might seem a bit strange for you who have not maybe been into the space sector, but if you look at future habitation on Moon and Mars and the space station, it's really like an enclosed and really everything is, we need to use everything again and it's really circular. And we really want to now work and bring all this knowledge back down to earth, of course. And Alexa, you mentioned the space data. And when it comes to the I.P.C.C. report that was released last week, actually 50% of all this data comes from the satellites. Mm-hmm. And that also maybe not so many people are aware of how much knowledge we actually get from the space sector. And what's happening now with the satellites, I mean, they have always been sending enormous amounts of data back down to Earth, reporting on how our planet is feeling at the moment. We know it's not feeling so good, so we're also developing the satellites so they become smarter. So instead of now sending this a lot of data down to Earth, they now are processing also data in the satellites and sending down the relevant data, which makes life easier for us on Earth, of course. I will actually go more in depth into the tourism sector in my next question. So it will be a little bit of a cliffhanger there.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for sharing your insights with us. Yesterday over dinner, Cecilia told us a story. She's working with a steel company in Sweden, and she created a prototype of an underwear that is resistant to the heat, using technology from space for doing that. That was one of these concrete examples, no?
Indeed.
Okay, thank you so much, Cecilia. I come now to my next speaker, Sergio Guerreiro. You are the Senior Director of Knowledge Management and Innovation in Turismo de Portugal. I think you are one person who is dealing since many years with data, like few others probably in this room besides Alexa, I assume. You are operating also or are behind observatories. We have in Portugal 3 observatories that are also members of the International Network of Sustainable Tourism Observatories, the I.S.A.A.C, Alentejo and Algarve. I know that also other regions will join the INSTO network because you are a believer in this measurement framework that this INSTO from UNWTO that we are running is helpful in going beyond the usual economic data that destinations are usually coming up with, how many arrivals, how many nights, how many spending is there. So from your perspective, Sergio, how do you see the role of destinations and DMOs arguing based on data, especially nature-related data? And when talking about data, we speak also about public goods that shall benefit of all. How do you see this?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. Thanks to our Moroccan friends for their hospitality. It has been a great experience. And actually, thank you very much for the opportunity of learning. And I think my participation in this panel is actually one proof of that. Every time that I come to a conference and I go back to my office, my team tells me, oh no, another new project with another new thing that we have to dig in. But actually the proof of this panel, absolutely, you'll see my notes that I prepared for this make perfect match what I've heard here. We are in Portugal, we are seriously believers of sustainability as a way to move forward. For us, it's not a buzzword, it's a commitment since 2017 where we've put on the strategy. Sustainability is the DNA of our strategy. We're committed to specific goals in terms of the pillar, economic, social, and environmental pillar. It was not an easy thing to put on the table, but we are progressing. But I would say accountability, and we've talked about accountability is very important for us. As Zoritza mentioned yesterday, we believe that transition is needed. And I think every time we keep talking in several aspects, but transition is actually needed, and we are reaching a point where it's fundamental. In Portugal, after the strategy, we released a sustainability action plan. We just launched an ESG initiative to put our companies on board of this process. We have a data for sustainability agenda, let's call it like that. I heard yesterday very nice inspiration on that, which is we cannot wait for the perfect framework. We have to start. So I think that's a bit what we've been doing. But to be honest, DMOs are in trouble. And actually the panel today was a proof of that, because complexity is around and we are touching on several topics. They're completely out of our knowledge base as destination management organizations, even at national or local level. So cooperation is absolutely critical here. And I believe this is a process, and I see this as a process with 4 steps: learn, measure, advocate, and support. Our focus and the work that we've been doing until now, it's basically on the 2 pillars. So it's learning about topics, new topic that comes in. How do we understand it? How can we measure? And how can we progress on that? The second thing is advocate. For us, data producers, is amazing to produce data, but actually the use of data. So that the way that we can advocate for the ones that have to make the decisions out of it is absolutely critical. And finally, the support one, which is how to implement change. How do I actually implement measures that they can take us on that? So what have we done? Well, we've started monitoring continuously 35 sustainability indicators, so learning and start measuring. We've set up regional observatories for sustainability, and what is the idea is to bring science and universities together with destinations so they can progress together in that field, and also have the opportunity of transfer knowledge to actually the local level, because yesterday also that was touched. Yet it's at the local level that most important, the most important decisions are made. But, and there is a big but on this, all the work we've been doing, it's on known metrics. The industry has been progressing, but we don't get out of the traditional metrics that we do, even economically or social. So what we've been doing is find new data sources that make it more timely, more accurate, but we are not getting outside. And that's why when we look at our policy agenda and the impacts of what we're doing, something is missing. Okay, something is missing, and that's why I would say, and the opportunity to participate in this panel, I think for us was quite positive in terms of make us think about it. Is nature-related data actually is a key for progress in this field? What we are already describing, and my word of describing is we are not there yet in terms of perfect understanding of the topic, but we are measuring energy consumption and CO2 emissions from our main tourism companies. So it was a learning process with our companies to understand where we are in terms of the status of the industry. We are also monitoring CO2 emissions from main source markets. So calculating what's the impact that comes from different options that we take as policies, because it's not indifferent in terms of the markets that we have. We've been measuring water qualities in destinations. What we are now experimenting in terms of nature-related data, and we've been searching for, and questions that we have on the table. What's the impact of dispersion of tourism in terms of air quality? We have been pushing for seasonality. We've been pushing for dispersion as policies, but is it really working? Does it make sense? Are in terms of the impacts, for example, in terms of water, air quality, is something changing? Well, it's a long-term agenda for that, but that's one thing that we have on the table. How is the quality of water evolving in most traditional destinations? Well, in Portugal, we have a problem on that because our levels of quality of water are amazingly great. So we don't feel any change on that, despite of the growth of the industry, because our quality of water is good. But we have to put in a system to actually measure flows and understand if things are changing. What is the impact of land use evolving in our destinations? Typically, we take a lot of decisions as part of a process in terms of planning, but then destinations, we don't look at it. And so we don't think long-term in that kind of things. The same with sea level rise. We are mostly based as a coastal destination. So what's the impact of that? How do we look at the future? So for us means also adding to our portfolio new data sources that might be around. Air quality is perhaps one, water quality, as I mentioned, another one. And for land use transformation, one thing that we've been watching in series of forums, and we identified a couple of sources, but I believe today I have a couple of more to actually dig in, is satellite data. And believe me that I put this before hearing your presentations. Well, also obviously I did a bit of research, but actually satellite destination has a huge power of giving us an idea how evolving the ecosystems, how evolving the land use of our territory are done. And we are far from exploring that in terms of tourism policy, in terms of evaluation of what we're doing. And it's an incredible tool that it's around. We just need to cooperate with the ones that understand. Because for us, it's a step even to a more complex set of data that we cannot understand. So that's why I call it a process, but for me, it's actually a life cycle. So I reached to the end in one dimension. Now we're back to learning. So great to be in this panel. Let's talk after this.
Thank you, Sergio. I highly appreciate your explanations and the views that you have from a destination level, actually. Especially at the end, that this is a process. We have new issues on the table. There should be more data that could be used. We don't know yet how to use it. What you say, it's a process. Sustainability, like what I always say, like democracy, a peace, is not a place where you arrive and unpack, but it's a continuous journey. And I think the journey continues. I know that Portugal, and you especially driving this, have been collecting lots of data, like you just mentioned, water, energy. We know this from the observatories, from the work that are working with the university. So they take the science-based basis for this, take relevant decisions at the destination level. So this is very impressive, but as you said, the journey goes on. This brings me to one of the aspects back of biodiversity, one of these data sets, nature-related data sets. Alexa, my next question is to you. When looking at biodiversity and the relationship between tourism and biodiversity, how do you see this relation from your perspective? What are damages and potential positives, for instance, nature-based solutions coming from data? And also maybe briefly the relationship between climate and biodiversity.
Yeah, I won't spend too long talking about the damages because I do think that we know them. But obviously land fragmentation is a massive one. Animals and natural processes need a lot of space to move and to flow. So there's a correlation between every time you build a new road, biodiversity loss increases because the animals can't cross, but also it allows stores and houses. So if you watch these time-lapse videos of roads being, put into the Amazon, for example, maybe for tourism, but it's still destroying that area of biodiversity. Invasive species is huge, and I think we need to be really careful about these flows of travel, water usage, all these things we know. I think it's quite interesting to talk about the positive and the nature-based solution side. So there's this 30 by 30 agreement that maybe some of you know about, right? Let's protect 30% of oceans and land by 2030. There's a role for the tourism sector. If you imagine that there's like these protected areas that now it's not like fortress conservation where you fence it off and no human goes in because that's not socially just or equitable. So I think that tourism has a role to create kind of these buffer zones where you are offering a bioeconomy or a sustainable livelihood. Ecotourism is one version, but there's many versions where those communities aren't forced to go into the land and cut down for resources or cut down for food. So I think that's a massive potential. There's a really interesting one as well, which is we need a lot more biodiversity data, and one of the best ways is to collect it from the ground. So there are a lot of really interesting initiatives that are now using guests to be like wildlife trackers, or to go and connect eDNA, environmental DNA, which is a super interesting development where you basically swab the water and you can tell who's there. So using destinations as a place for the citizen science, I think is really interesting. What else did I write down? Obviously, sustainable food and value chains. You know, you're in a destination where you're eating something that was flown from miles away. So I think the opportunity that destinations have to educate their clients on where their food is coming from and those chains is super interesting. And obviously connecting people with nature. There's kind of three ways, you touched on them more. One is baseline, right? So if you do want to implement these solutions, how do you baseline? Our tools are some ways, but there's many ways. And then you monitor the change over time, but you have to set a goal. So what do we want to regenerate here and how? And that's often a multi-stakeholder process with the local communities. And then you do the impact monitoring over time. And trust me, the technology is exponential. We're going to get much better at this. So if you're ready, start to baseline and set the goals now in 2-3 years, like what you know about the land you're operating in will be exponential. Climate and biodiversity. We were talking about this yesterday. There's this weird thing in the climate movement where it's like, we need to solve climate before we get to biodiversity, which is, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like there is no net zero without nature positive. It cannot happen, right? There's no climate without biodiversity, because like the soil organisms, the trees, the ecosystems are the regulators of our planet's cycles. It's all the feedback loops, right? It's water cycles, it's peat bogs, it's forests. So we can't think of these as two separate things. And the climate movement for a long time has segregated them. And I think finally we're seeing them come together. So that for me is really critical and really important. And actually was reading this article 2 days ago that was saying, you know, solar panels are great, but they're not going to feed birds. They're not going to like influence water cycles. They're not going to manage a watershed. For that, you need trees. So this trade-off, right, is we have to think we can have a net zero world, but if there's no nature in it, I don't want to live in that world. No. So I think we need to be very conscious about that.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts and considerations in this regard. Jesús, as indicated by Alexa, it seems that nature-related data is now used by other sectors also. However, it seems that tourism somehow, or is it a question that I want to ask, do you think that tourism is lacking behind from your perspective? Is this impression correct? What is the EU doing in this context, and is the green eco-label connected to all this?
So this is a difficult question, because I would not say, or I don't think really that tourism is lagging behind.
Good.
So on top of the complexity that we explained before, we were talking about this, tourism is a sector of sectors. So tourism means transport, it means accommodation, it means construction, food. So this brings even more complexity to the complexity of a single sector. So it's of course very difficult for an operator to say, okay, I'm going to solve all my environmental problems. Where to start? So it's so difficult. The tools that you mentioned, the European Union tools, are based on this idea of empowering citizens or consumers. So allowing a more informed decision. So one of the tools is as you mentioned, is the EU Ecolabel. It's voluntary, as you know, and is mainly based on pressures. So it has the limitations that I mentioned before. So it's about reducing energy consumption, it's about reducing CO2 emissions, waste, water, etc. So the typical or the most traditional indicators. Then the EU is working heavily on, and this is more interesting because it's more comprehensive, on environmental footprint methods. And this is really, this analyzes much more. But again, there is not any legislation that oblige to use these methods. And what I think, looking a little bit forward, Alexa mentioned the Kunming-Montreal global biodiversity framework. So just before going to Montreal, the European Commission adopted the nature restoration law. It's also very important. So, and in both cases, there is a very strong component of monitoring. So what I can expect is that there will be more data to be collected, methodologies, and to be used. And the examples that you were mentioned are super interesting, and you have to talk with my colleagues, by the way. So yeah.
Thank you, Jesús. Let me now ask Cecilia, coming back to the space perspective and then space technology. We have heard yesterday about these limited resources, and you mentioned it also, like water. Who from the private sector is using the knowledge that we are getting from space? Do we have experiences for the tourism sector? And what can the tourism sector take from space technology or space data, actually?
Thank you again for, I'm so happy being here, and it's fantastic to meeting a new sector like the tourism sector. And as we discussed, it's very complex, as it's so many different industries combined in this. And we have experience from working with many different industries, like you mentioned, the steel industry and a lot in the property sectors and so on. And normally in my company, we could only work with like 2-3 companies per year. But in the new company that you mentioned, I.S.A.A.C, we are now planning to work in a new innovation process with 20-30 companies per year, as we work more in an online activity. So we will be happy to find a lot of activities working in the tourist sector. And we have, of course, examples that we have been working with. And I must just say, before I go into this, I was so inspired by yesterday's panels and speakers, and it feels like there is really an ambition of going into action. And as we heard from Inge Huybrecht, she said we need to go fast and far to do that, and we need to collaborate. And that's, of course, go fast and far. Then she should, and everyone should go and add space to their innovations, of course. And looking into innovations a little bit more, we are working actually right now with a Swedish company that focus on international and domestic destination development. So that is super interesting. So we're just a little bit starting to working with the tourist, specifically tourist sector. And a lot of the questions we touched upon yesterday, and we discussed here also, when it comes to everything from a lot of technology needs and food waste, and also energy and packaging, and a lot of those questions we are now addressing with this company, specifically working with more tourism and destinations. And when it comes to water, we have been talking about that also a lot specifically. I wanted to bring up also what we mentioned before, the astronaut lifestyle, as I call it. Like the astronauts in the space station, they use 26 liters of water per person a day. And in Sweden, sorry to say, but we use 160 liters of water per person a day. So talking about data and also setting numbers on this, we understand that there is a lot of things to learn from this, what I call the astronaut lifestyle. Also, when it comes to food and food waste, the astronauts get a totally calculated exactly how much food they need per day when it comes to nutrition and their specific needs, which means that we have no food waste at all in the space station. So we see that we have a lot of things that we can really contribute to in many of these different aspects, of course. And also when it comes to buildings, we have been working quite a lot in the construction and property sector. And we have been specifically looking into building at NASA Ames, one of the NASA centers outside of San Francisco, where they have integrated a lot of different space technologies. And to mention the water factor, in this specific building, it consumes 90% less water than a traditional building. So it's not like it's 7, 8, 9%, but rather 70, 80, 90%. So that's why I'm now so eager with a new company and the new process, which actually our Swedish astronaut is co-owner in. So it also shows the ambition from the astronauts of really supporting these initiatives and contribute with the insights and technology from the space sector, as we see so many parallels between them. And also we have specific material that we look into even more now. It's called an aerogel, to be more into specific materials. So not only the satellites is supporting us, but a lot of materials and technologies. So the aerogel we have now been integrating in paint when painting the facades of houses, it actually reduces the energy consumption also in buildings. So it's a lot of things going on now in the space sector, I can assure you. And also when we were working with Electrolux, I asked them, do you want to know how we plan for the washing machines in space? And they were like, yes, it would be nice to hear. And I said, we will only have like a bag, put in the dirty clothes and add some bacteria, close it for 24 hours, and then we have clean clothes. And then they were like, oh, no water needed, no. And also almost no material. And we discussed also yesterday with the cement. I mean, they still use the cement in the washing machines. And so you can imagine it's really like revolutionary if we go into using this, not only like the concept, but it's all about the mindset. I say we have all the technologies we could ever wish for. So now it's more the creativity we need to add to these things. And to finalize also from my side with biodiversity, people were a bit surprised, but they said, so Cecilia, now you're also working with elephants? And I said, yes, they just entered into my life when I understood that terribly it's 55 elephants per day that is killed by poachers. So then I said, okay, we need to start a project. So now we are also engaged in the Space for Wildlife project to see how we can help stop poaching with the help of space technologies, and everything from, of course, help from satellites, but also back to the rangers who is protecting the animals, looking into everything from their everyday life. How can we support them in their extreme environments? For example, they have tents they live in, and then with all these sandstorms, they can't close the zipper of the tent, so snakes come in. I wouldn't like that. So I said, okay, we find a zipper from space for you, of course, as well. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting. There's so much new ideas coming from this area. And God, who knows, maybe in 50 years we will say, oh God, back then we washed our clothes with water, of how old-fashioned we were back then. Yeah. So maybe that's the future for all of us here. Thank you for sharing this insight. It's really interesting to listen to you. Sergio, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure considers 5 main drivers of nature change: climate change, resource exploitation, land and sea use change, pollution, and invasive alien species. So five drivers of nature change. So climate change being one of them. What Portugal, you touched on that already in your first intervention, what Portugal will do or is doing, and when talking about nature-related evidence, where do you stand with it, and where do you want to go with this?
Well, a very good question, not easy to answer, but from our perspective, the role of the private sector is quite important in driving this agenda, but we need to understand where they are. So what we do, I think we have an operation with more than 10 years. We do a survey on accommodation services in Portugal to understand how is their performance in environmental practices, also social practices, but this is the topic, environmental practices. And actually has been a learning journey for us in terms of progress and understanding and identifying who are the leaders, who are the key companies that we can put on spot as inspiration for the others. And actually one excellent news that we had from that survey that we do is last year we've surveyed 3,000 hotels in Portugal, and we got 70% of response rate, which is the highest that we have ever had Why? Because people understand that sustainability is part of the agenda. So that's one first block of it. The second one is when talking to data, we seriously believe that we have to make use cases that solve a problem of someone. Our marketing people have the responsibility of advertising Portugal abroad. So bringing more tourists inside. What we are currently doing is actually monitoring, as I mentioned, monitoring CO2 emissions from main source markets. What is our case for them is it possible for you to keep doing your job, but we will provide you with the info that can help you to make your job in a more sustainable way. So finding the right mix of markets that can bring to Portugal the same value in terms of tourism, but actually in the ideal and optimal way in terms of source markets that can feed sustainability actions. So that's the 2 blocks of work that we've been doing. Well, not impressive as you guys, but believe me, that for us is, I would say, a very good case. But also, Cecilia mentioned a very important topic for us, which is innovation. And we have actually to build, and we've built in Portugal, an ecosystem innovation that works together with companies to find innovative solutions to actually solve current problems. In food, we have one dedicated program only for food. And believe me, a lot of solutions come out of there to make sustainability is definitely a topic that we learn also from the program. So new kinds of food, new kinds of materials used, new kinds of techniques used. Another one, we have another specific program only dedicated to sustainability solutions, mostly in energy efficiency. And we have our biggest energy company in Portugal, part of the program. So helping companies and startups actually to progress on that. And we believe that bringing together, and I think sometimes we don't do that, is connecting data with innovation that actually can, in the end of the day, make transformation at firms level. Because if for us around the table is complex, believe me that I'm an SME with 2.5 people in my company and I have to run my office. It's even more complex. So we have to create, from our perspective at national or regional level, powerful ecosystems that actually can support, in the end of the day, the transformation that companies need to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That means we are in this transition to a net zero, nature positive tourism sector. We still have a lot of work to do. So my last question to all of you would be, we have touched up many topics here now. This is where we stand. We know what is out there. We know what we have with regards to nature-related data. And now what? What needs to happen next in order to ensure that we become net zero and nature positive? What do you suggest, Jesús, if I may start with you?
Yeah, so I'm not going to say anything original, and I'm going to repeat what other speakers yesterday and today say. So the pathway that we have to follow is first to awareness raising, education. It was one of the topics yesterday. Collaboration. We again repeated the message today. And then especially for stakeholders, I mean practitioners, operators, who maybe are not the most advanced or destinations also in terms of making the pathway to sustainability, to start with a prioritization. So we explained today, we were talking about this problem of complexity. So you cannot solve all problems at the same time. You need to prioritize. First, you explain it very well. You have to know what is your situation, what are the main problems, and then start by them looking for solutions.
Thank you. Alexa.
Yeah, on the prioritization piece, there's the LEAP framework, LEAP, which kind of assists you in doing that, which is quite useful. I think the data is there. All of the people acting inside of that space, TNFD, ourselves, others, are trying to make simplified measures of the complexity. So yes, it may seem overwhelming, but at the end of the day, for example, our index would be 0 to 1, right? And I know many people thinking in that way. So I think the excuse that was used for a long time by many corporations of, oh, there isn't enough data. it's not true. And I think now it's really evident. And that's why the mandatory disclosures are there, because the writing's on the wall, as they say. A lot of money is flowing into this space. So I think it's actually a really interesting opportunity. And on the flip side of that, you don't want to be fined or caught lagging behind. And I think that getting ahead of the curve soon is actually quite prudent. So that would be my, I guess, my sort of
Thank you.
lasting message.
Thank you, Alexa. Cecilia, please.
Yeah, I mean, the short reply would be add space, of course, to evolve it a little bit. I would say the moon landing, we know, was pushing the limits for what all thought was possible. And I can't highly enough, encourage you all on the importance of pushing the limits now when it comes to achieving Agenda 2030. So by adding space and in a wider extent to Agenda 2030, we have like a new toolbox available to explore. But as I always say, it's always about the people. So it's we people that need to do something and to take the actions. And I used to say I collect on the why not people that when they are presented for a little bit of an odd idea or maybe never tested idea before, they can actually say why not. So I hope we have a lot of why not people in the room. And for those of you who are why not people, I'm very happy to speak with you on opportunities for the tourism sector continuously. And you know where to find me the coming 2 days. I'm here.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for the question. Well, I'm a fan of ecosystems, and I believe what we need to build for this is actually an ecosystem of learning and exploring with public sector. And by public sector, I mean DMOs, but I also mean science, universities, ministries, and so on. So working together on that. Second pillar, private sector, as I mentioned, fundamental, but also consumers. Sometimes we talk about and we discuss this only from the supply side, but we need to put on board the consumers also, because it doesn't, I can have the perfect hotel with the perfect practices of sustainability, reduction of water in bath, but if I took 2 hours in taking my shower, it doesn't make any sense. So we're building these ecosystems of learning and exploring together with this ecosystem and thinking about all the pillars. One way fundamental. Second one, a little bit of lesson from data producers, and we have to bring empathy on this also. And by empathy, I mean, I have to put myself in the shoes of the guy that has to take the decision, so I can make my conversation accessible to them. Because when we're dealing with complexity, sometimes what we do is we keep using our language. Which that means that, well, I'm doing my work, but in the end of the day, the one that has to implement change, the one that has to change and to transform is not able to understand because it's too much complex. So I think empathy it's actually a tool for us. It's the same. That's why now I build use cases for specific problems for people, because they don't need to know which algorithm I'm using. They just need to do that. This solves that problem and help them to progress.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we are coming to an end of this panel. I think we have touched upon many things. As I said, nature-related data is of key importance. There is experience out there. We are on a journey of transition where this particular kind of data is very much needed at all levels. We see that the private sector is leading in this particular regard with all the initiatives that are out there and on which we briefly touched. It's a transition that is needed, as the executive director yesterday also said, and a journey that we only can do in a most collaborative spirit. We need to travel together within our ecosystem, but also look beyond our ecosystem, look at the space and especially at the science sites. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, I would say a very warm applause, strong applause to this great panelists. Well done. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.